bonk. Okay, let's turn the next layer. So next one is basically just more details. Let's go back to our notes. So this layer here, just boom, boom, a little bit more details to match the photography detail. The thing about working off a photo plate is that a photo has a lot of details, very refined stuff. You know, zoom in here is all this stuff, you know, windows and all these little highlights. So you got to make sure that whatever you add into it could hold up the same detail level. Because if I paint something super rough and airbrushy looking down here, it ain't gonna look good because it's obviously gonna look like it's photoshopped, simply because your detail level didn't match. So doing photo paintings take a little bit more time because you have to match the quality, the density, right? All the 3D, if you do 3D out there, you know what I'm talking about. It's kind of like density mapping. So for example, you have a cube. Oops, let me turn my opacity back on. So opacity off, right? The thing I'm talking about here is a photo has a very high density. So if I was to do this in 3D and had a cube and we map a UV of checkerboards on a photo, the checkerboard will be very, very fine. You see? So for all of you guys, you know, working in the video game industry, you guys will all, of course, know what I'm talking about here. Right? You have this very fine checkerboard. I mean, today's games, you get super, super fine stuff down here. You know, using like 4K textures, you get very high density textures like this. So that's what a photo is doing. It has this high density. Now imagine I went in here and putting a low density texture. So the rest of this is mapped at 4K, for example, right? And now I go in here and put a 256 texture. The density will all of a sudden go to this. And if this is a video game, the player, you know, say this is a player, will walk up to this device and say, hey, why is this texture so blurry and stretched out? That's exactly what's happening if you are working off a photo plate that has high density around it and you add an image in here that has low density. Whoever's looking at this image will feel like something's not right, that this piece here stands out. So you need to go back and remap this to a 4K texture as well, right? If we're talking about 3D here, and match the density level. You see? And if you want to do a crazier painting, kind of like the ones we did for Skull Village, what we've done there is take a section out and map it with an even tighter texture. For example, it's a 4K texture here. We put another 4K texture in here, which is super, super dense. And so a player from this distance sees this object as pretty high res. When they walk up to it, it still holds up that res. And this is what a lot of games do to keep the high resolution up, right? Versus mapping this, because from here they can only see this. Let me switch a brush here. If they're standing this close, they can only see this anyways. They don't need to map the rest of this all in high res, but when they step back over here, they can see the entire object in high res. Anyways, this is more about 3D and texture mapping, but it's the same logic, so hopefully that makes sense here. So that's why these little miniature details is quite important. Alright, this step I'm starting to put in some design work. Let's zoom in here. It's dark. I'm painting without light here. It's all in the shadows, but you can sort of make out the designs of a staircase. You can see here's a staircase, and I kind of just use whatever the kind of crappy stuff that's kind of underneath the photo to do it. So here's a staircase here. There's an entrance over here, and a little bit more staircases here to start creating a sense of human inhabitants and space. Let's go on to the next layer. This is the foreground element that we mentioned a little bit earlier. This fallen building allows me to have this kind of foreground destroyed building falling down to create that sense of depth. So we have 1, 2, and then 3, right? All the stuff back here is 3. So foreground, middle ground, background. Okay, so let me delete all these off. Boom, 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 boom. Okay, next layer. So very, very small details added in here. So boom. So again, these are tutorials, so I leave all my layers on. Generally, it will not be this messy. Alright. Here, I added some light source. These lights come from other photographs. Other photographs of Hong Kong, actually, I think. So what I've done is I just copy and pasted a bunch of those things in here to start my first source of light. So if I turn this to black and white, you can see these are genuine light sources. Remember, these are primary lights. Let me get my notes. Right, all these, the primary lights, just like the sun, which is a primary light. Primary light meaning that it gives off its own lighting source. It's not a balanced light. So when you turn it to black and white, they need to read as a primary light, because I could paint something like yellow in here, right? For example, I could sample that and go to, let's go to like say a yellow orange kind of thing. Okay, paint that in here. Because say, yeah, this one, let's select this one here, for example, right? But we keep the value dark. Because yeah, that's orange. I mean, that's some kind of color. Let's go more saturated. Okay, so let's paint that in here. Let's say that's fire. But when you check out the value, turn this on. You can see they're quite dark. That's not a light source. It's just a color. So even though, yes, it's orange like fire or light, it's actually not bright. It doesn't give off a high value. So let me get rid of that layer. So with these little lights, I could check that obviously they are giving off high values. They're almost going to white, right? Close to, you know, a white or a high value gray. Yeah. So they are a light source. And now I start lighting those up. See? So this layer, we bring in a little bit. And to save time, this is actually on a dodge layer. I don't use this often. It's better to actually paint. But in certain cases like this, it works quite well, especially for this kind of orange lighting source. But be careful with this brush. As I mentioned in the previous tutorials, don't overuse this brush, this layer, dodge layer. It's very dangerous. And you also have to erase out light that shouldn't be there. Okay, so if you overspray it, for example, if I take this and do this, it could turn to this very, very ugly, and light does not do this, obviously, right? And it doesn't bleed into these areas. You gotta erase it out. So a dangerous brush to use, but quite useful to get some initial values in there. Just don't do this kind of stuff. Okay. Now I bring in some volumetric fog to lessen the value in the distance to start creating a first read. Whoops, not yet. Let me get my notes here. Now here's a volumetric fog to create a first read and point the viewer's eye down to here. You can see the difference it makes. Before, it's kind of all sort of flat. With this added, it starts to create a little bit more visual contrast into this area. And now I bring in some other photo textures to help create foreground. Because this is a photo plate, right, and you want to keep it photo real, then we bring in elements that have very high density. So these plants that I brought in here are very high in density, meaning that I can zoom in and I can see very fine details. This will help to bring the depth from here to here and make me believe that this is actually close to camera, because this density is higher than this density. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. Here's a few more of the same kind of textures. You can see if I zoom in here, you can see some plants, some ferns, right? And this has higher density than the stuff going on here, tricking the human eye to think that this is closer to camera than over here. Okay. Next, a few more of these textures I kind of throw around onto these buildings to make it look like it's plant growth. You can see, just copy and paste it everywhere. There's some up here as well, some just miscellaneous plant growth. Continue copying up. This one over here as well. So you can see in all these areas, we added these kind of overgrown plant textures to start getting that post-apocalyptic gold overtaken by Earth kind of feel. Okay, and that finished paint layer number 1. So all we did here is add these elements, destroy the building, add some plants, manipulated the value slightly to get this. So let me save Camtasia real quick and we'll continue again.